Currently, Earth.
It was on February 2nd in the year 1848 that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed, ending the Mexican-American War in favor of the United States. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo added an additional 525,000 square miles to the U.S. territory, including the area that would become the states of Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona, as well as parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Controversy during and after the war pitted President James K. Polk, our nation's 11th president, in a political war against two future presidents, Zachary Taylor, our nation's 12th president, and Abraham Lincoln, our nation's 16th president. Polk, a Democrat, ignited the Mexican-American War when he sent his commanding general of the Army, Zachary Taylor, and his troops to claim territory along the Rio Grande River between the U.S. and Mexico. Polk insisted Mexico had invaded the U.S. when an earlier skirmish between American and Mexican troops erupted over the ill-defined territorial boundaries of Texas. Polk's actions at the time were immediately denounced by Abraham Lincoln, then a leading Whig member of Congress, who described the resulting war as unconstitutional, unnecessary, and expensive. While Taylor performed his military duty in Texas, Polk wrestled with congressional opposition led by Lincoln in Washington. Polk was a firm believer in America's manifest destiny of increased U.S. territorial expansion in order to bring democracy and Protestant Christianity to a backward region. Lincoln and his cohorts protested not so much expansionism itself, but Polk's justification of the war. Although the war ended favorably for the U.S., Lincoln continued to attack Polk after the signing of the treaty for his lack of an exit strategy that clearly defined citizenship and property rights for former Mexican citizens. Lincoln called the president a bewildered, confounded, and miserably perplexed man. Although Polk's war was successful, he lost public support after 2 bloody years of fighting, during which 1,773 men continued their eternity, and a whopping $100 million was spent. Meanwhile, Taylor earned national popularity for his heroic actions during the war and for the camaraderie he shared with even his lowliest subordinates. When the war ended, Taylor decided to run for the presidency. One of his political mentors happened to be Abraham Lincoln, who wrote a note to Taylor after the war ended, advising him of what he ought to say regarding the Mexican-American War and the question of slavery in any newly won territories. Lincoln suggested that Taylor should declare, quote, "We should probably be under a sort of necessity of taking some territory, but it is my desire that we shall not acquire any extending so far south as to enlarge and aggravate the distracting question of slavery," unquote. Polk chose not to run again for the presidency, and Taylor barely won the popular vote in a race that included former President Martin Van Buren, our 8th president, and Democratic nominee Lewis Cass. Van Buren, the Free Soil Party candidate and former Democrat, acted as a spoiler, siphoning off Democratic votes that would likely have gone to Cass. Unfortunately for Lincoln, Taylor and his immediate successors failed to address the issue of slavery during their terms, leaving the question to Lincoln to solve over a bloody civil war a decade later. On February 2nd in 1913, New York City's Grand Central Terminal opened for the very first time. The transportation hub as we know it today began construction in 1903, but before that, 89 East 42nd was home to an older steam train station built in 1879. Even though the station had been updated to deal with an increased volume of commuters coming from suburbs outside the city, a collision between outdated steam trains in 1902 continued the eternity of 15 people and made it clear that a more substantial renovation was needed. That same year, engineer William Willis and railroad tycoon Cornelius Vanderbilt began planning the landmark that Grand Central is today. They proposed a station with new electric trains that would not emit exhaust fumes and could, for the first time, operate underground. Planning officials also changed the station's name. Technically, a station because trains no longer went south to Grand Central Station. The hub was renamed Grand Central Terminal. While these renovations and improvements had practical value, the more significant impact that both Wilgus and Vanderbilt hoped to create was cultural. Grand Central was designed to usher New York into the dynamic 20th century. As the world around it grew increasingly interconnected, Vanderbilt wanted Grand Central to overtake its rival Penn Station as the palatial gateway to the heart of a rapidly growing country. The ambition was manifested in the form of a towering white marble facade and a ceiling mural depicting God's view of the sky. After almost 10 years of construction and more than $4 billion in today's money, New York's architectural marvel opened to the world. Despite initial success, Grand Central eventually fell into severe disrepair. This due to an increase in highway use and gradual neglect. Even the ceiling blackened due to cigarette smoke. As early as 1945, there were calls to tear down the building. However, the destruction of the original Penn Station between 1963 and 1966 sparked a movement to preserve architecturally significant buildings in New York, including Grand Central. Several high-profile New Yorkers, including former First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis and architect Philip Johnson, formed the committee to save Grand Central. The committee fought to preserve Grand Central's status as a landmark building, ensuring it could never be torn down. A $100 million restoration beginning in 1980 reestablished Grand Central as a bustling monument to the power and grandeur of New York City. It was February 2nd in the year 1980 that details of Abscam, an FBI operation to uncover political corruption in the government, are released to the public. 31 public officials were targeted for investigation, including Representative John Murphy of New York, 5 other representatives, and Harrison Williams, a senator from New Jersey. In the operation, FBI agents posed as representatives of Abdul Enterprises Ltd., a fictional business owned by an Arab sheikh. Under FBI video surveillance, the agents met with the officials and offered them money or other considerations in exchange for special favors, such as the approval of government contracts for companies in which the sheikh had invested. Senator Williams and Representatives Murphy, Michael J. Myers, Richard Kelly, and John W. Jenrette Jr. were ultimately convicted of bribery and corruption. All but Richard Kelly, who had his conviction overturned in 1982 on the basis that the FBI had unlawfully entrapped him, left Congress. John Murphy, whose term ended in 1981, was saved the fate of expulsion suffered by William and Myers. John Jenrette resigned in 1980. In 1962, 7 whites and 4 blacks were arrested after an all-night sit-in at Englewood, New Jersey City Hall. This particular sit-in focused on ending segregation in U.S. schools. On February 2nd, in 1948, President Truman, our nation's 33rd president, sent Congress an anti-lynching message urging the adoption of a civil rights program, including a Fair Employment Practice Commission. The information documented on this audio file can be verified on history.com.